Hello, good afternoon. I have a fan here. The advantage of being the last, I think, is that I'm able to summarize and also give some conclusions to what has happened the last 2 days. But the other thing is also there's been, in a way, a repeat of what my colleagues have been saying. And it's a good thing. It's a way of validating and consolidating what we feel are museums without walls. So let me start by talking about museum practice actually in the Philippines and just focus on that for this presentation. There was something that we did for the National Museum recently. On July 1, it's kind of really very historical because on July 1, we decided that all national museums, the 3 flagship museums in Manila plus the 15 museums all over the country will have free admission forever. And that has been one way of liberating the museum from all the issues that we have about creating obstacles for people to go in the museum. So let me start with this first slide. Okay. We have a law. In 1998, the Congress passed the National Museum Act. And the main thing is that we were echoing what the International Council of Museums have been saying that what museums should do. It should be nonprofit. It should actually look at what we have. But of course, we are in the middle also of changing the law. Hopefully by next year, we will have amendments to our law because one of the things that we have to change is the language. It still refers to man and not persons, no? So we have to do that too. Oh, sorry. Wait. It's not moving? Okay. It's not moving. Okay. Oh, good. Okay, sorry. And we would like to think that museums are contact zones. And I have James Clifford to acknowledge here in his book, Roots. And that we want to think of museums as dynamic and diverse, and that we have to see that as areas of either confluence or meeting places. And I will show you why we subscribe to this at the National Museum. We really need to look at this seriously because if museums are not contact zones, then they would just be passive receptacles of history. So we do have the physical museum, and it's contrast to what we have also, what's happening in the 21st century of having virtual museums. This is going to be our new museum that will open next year. It's the Museum of Natural History. It's a repurposed building, and it used to be the Department of Tourism building. So we would like to talk about that in the future. Inside, we've covered the courtyard, and because the trustees wanted a wow factor, so we had to build something that's going to be really quite spectacular. But that's really my point. No? There should be something else besides the wow factor, and should be the collections and people. So this is the National Museum of Anthropology. It's a twin building of the Natural History Museum, and it's been open since 1998, and it houses both anthropological and archaeological collections. And this is a view from our office, actually. Our offices are located in another building. It's the National Museum of Fine Arts. And what we have been doing increasingly, because Manila is very, very urbanized and lacks green space, is that we're greening our rooftops as well. So, but again, that can become areas of contacts. We have 15 museums all over the country, and some are site museums where we we have to take care of caves and rock shelter burial sites and archaeological sites. So it's quite a lot of work. And on a good day, I'm always out of Manila. So we have, for instance, a museum in the southern part of the Philippines, Zamboanga, where we have a large Muslim population, and it's an old Spanish fort. And we have one that's at the very top end of the Philippines, closer to Taiwan, in fact, which is the National Museum of Batanes, that will open in October this year. So quite a lot of work. But the main thing is really that museums are shaped by people who we consider our audiences and partners. And this has been the phenomena since July 1, that people are queuing to get into the museum. So it's really gratifying to see that. But it also unmasked a lot of things that we have not done at the museum. And that's, for instance, age-appropriate programs, other ways of engaging audiences. So we need to do much, much more. So these are some of the things that they're queuing up for. It's a very large painting by a 19th century master. His name is Juan Luna. And this won the 1884 Spanish Exposition competition. And so this became a gift of Franco in the 1960s from Spain to the Philippines. And it's a rather large painting. I've seen grown people cry before it because they've seen it in reproductions, like on textbooks and all that. And then when they see this, it's really quite breathtaking. And we have unusual spaces. So we actually refer to also the National Museum as a historical place. And this space is sometimes used as an exhibition space, and sometimes it's an event space. No? So it's quite flexible, but we managed to restore this. I came into the National Museum in 2011, and we managed to restore this in 2012. But my boss actually did much of the work because he really had an affinity for heritage structures. So that's him with a potential donor at the time. His name is Benji Toda, a professional photographer. He was so moved by what we were trying to do, restoring that was the old Senate session hall. Sorry, and that he decided to give his services as a professional photographer. He's now been photographing all our collections. You know, it's a growing collection of fine arts, and we're quite happy that he's done that. We work also with scientists because the National Museum is a general museum. It takes care of taxonomic work in zoology, geology, and botany. So this is our team with the California Academy of Sciences because we're studying the coral triangle. And so the results of these studies are now going to go into an exhibition at the Natural History Museum that will open next year. We work with a lot of politicians because we really need to raise funds. And we need to get their endorsement. We're very pragmatic that way. This is a congressman from Ifugao, from where the rice terraces are, because we also have a museum there, and we were taking him around the fine arts galleries. This is one of our biggest patrons, actually, Senator Lauren Legarda, who has been really the prime mover in a lot of things, especially she's actually posing with our staff wearing the new uniforms that is compliant with the Tropical Fabrics Law, which requires government employees' uniform to have a percentage of traditional fabrics. No? So she's very happy with that. So we want to make our politicians also happy. But the main thing is really we have to engage with the public. Very, very important. We have, of course, all sorts of audiences. But the main thing that we're targeting now is really children, especially from the disadvantaged communities, which, as you know, the Philippines has a lot. So we have all these back of room work, which is sometimes more exciting than the front of room. And so what we want to do is really to convey that to our audience. We have been conserving this very large painting that was in the Manila City Hall, and it's done by Carlos Francisco. It's about 65 meters long and about maybe 2 meters high. And so that's actually my boss right there with the conservators. And it was also a good opportunity for training students in conservation. We've also started to work with our staff, because I think if we're going to go out there and talk to people, we need to really learn to talk with each other. And I think that's sometimes a neglected factor. And so I've been working with them, and then we've initiated an internal roundtable discussion. And it's mainly focused on when we're preparing for exhibitions. So it's also an interdisciplinary discussion. So for this, we're working on a very special indigenous group in the Philippines, which are the Aitas, the Negritos, and because they've been a neglected part of Philippine culture too. They've been marginalized for a long time. And also the speakers usually are the younger researchers, so we can push them to work harder. And so this is like a scene that we have typically. We talk about these things a lot. But the main thing is really to get them to talk. So there has been quite a lot of shifts in terms of collecting in the Philippines. And so we don't just collect material culture, but also intangible heritage. And I think some of my colleagues have already raised that as a very good point. We need to have stories behind objects. We can't just have, all these things, wonderful things. In fact, sometimes the simpler objects have much more stories to tell. And then we have to also account for all these Filipino diaspora, the diasporic communities. And I always tease my friends that, the reason why there's so many Filipinos all over the world is that it's part of our world domination project. But of course, that's not true. But I'll tell you more about it later. We also have more critical voices from the native or source communities. A lot of them actually have far more experience sometimes than us in the lowland urban areas. And so they have become very, very critical of what we do, and we accept that, and it's very important to have that dialogue. And of course, we have also been subscribing to the Intangible Cultural Heritage Program. It's very important, especially in terms of creating a map. We have 185 languages in the Philippines. You can imagine, because we have all these islands. And so we have to find ways of bringing that out, that this cultural diversity, as well as biodiversity in the Philippines. So my colleague ahead of me actually talked about intangible heritage. And so we have to account for the non-physical heritage. It's very, very important. And also the protection of intellectual copyrights. A lot of the private industries, like, for instance, the pharmaceuticals, have been, in a way, mining all this knowledge from traditional knowledge bearers. And we have to find ways of protecting their knowledge so that they can't be exploited that way. So we also want to look at the anthropological concept of cultural space, which is quite interesting, especially if you focus on the non-physical heritage of sites. So let's go back to André Malraux and his concept of museum imaginary. I think it's very, very important to think about how imagination can really bring forward better things for the museum. It carries with it hope, aspiration, and what we would like the museum to become, in the sense that we could use the material culture of the represented by collections as well as the non-material ones, and then how we can put that together. But I think during the time when Malraux said this in 1942 and wrote about it and theorized about it, he was just really thinking about how to liberate all these images from its new context. Some people say that when objects are brought into the museum, they are decontextualized. But in a more positive way of thinking about it is that objects can be also recontextualized. The new context is the museum context. But the use of Malraux's kind of very, in a way that at the time quite revolutionary thinking is that it also inspired artists like Dali and his surrealist movement. And so this is his take on Malraux's museum without walls. He can put odd things together and create a very surrealistic image of how he's put that together. But I think I would like to go a little bit back. In 1934, Walter Benjamin actually mentioned that because of the reproduction, there's a lot of ways of reproducing images in a faster way, not only through photography, but means of other, like printmaking and printing. He said that, that images can be reproduced from, for instance, masterpieces. And that masterpiece actually becomes very, very popular. But at the same time, people can do things with it, with those images. And, just to refer back to that big painting that I showed you a while ago, and why people kind of tear up whenever they see the actual big painting, is that they've seen so many reproductions of it. But somehow it didn't lose its aura, no? When people actually saw the real thing. And then I think that's the advantage of museums. They can actually see real stuff. No? So, Walter Benjamin said, we can reproduce these classical masterpieces. So, you just go around and mine the online sources and you'll have Mona Lisa in curlers, no? Or, with her cell phone, no? Things like that. You can do a lot of things like that. And now young people are putting memes on it and saying, putting dialogue and thought bubbles on artworks. And then later on, John Berger, an art historian, actually did much more because he's a Marxist, no? And he was thinking about other ways of appreciating images, especially photography. And this book is really quite useful in understanding how images impact on our society, especially advertising. So I want to go back to museums, no? What Malraux is she's come up with a book on legal framework, no? So she was saying that we can define museums in terms of ethics, morality, and institutional integrity. It's very important. Museums have a built-in, a tacit kind of trust. And if we don't build on that trust, we will lose it. No? So, because we start from that high point, and then we have to keep proving ourselves. And we have to also operationalize the philosophy and mission of the museum. We can't just keep saying, we'll do this, we'll do that, but we'll have to show it. We have to have an outcome. So we also have to exercise oversight, particularly for heritage concerns. And then we have to manage the museum from different perspectives. I told you we work with politicians, we work with experts. We have to also manage our trustees. We have to keep them happy. And we have staff. And then volunteers. We shouldn't forget volunteers. So museology is actually quite important in terms of a scientific discipline. No? It has to be interdisciplinary, has to be transdisciplinary and cross-disciplinary. And it is an academic discipline now. A lot of people have actually studied this as a course in tertiary level and even in postgraduate levels. It refers fundamentally to the relationship between people and the material world. And this is from one of the classic sources of museology, by Stransky. And then also this is the scientific basis for the museum profession. And finally, we should use it as a tool for understanding heritage. So when we ask, what are the museums for? Who is it for? And I think I would go for Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And the idea is really that you have to experience the world. You have to be part of that world. You cannot just be like this distant person from that. You know, the wall is actually even within the museum with all the glass cases and all that. So I would like to kind of present to you, this is not a new concept, it started in the 70s, but I would like to present to you other possibilities of how to regard museums. So the eco-museum concept is, it actually is not very new. It looks into the care for, studies, and research the entire heritage of communities, including natural environment and culture found in a place. So just to give you the etymology, it comes from that Greek word, which means home. And the eco-museum's emphasis is an integrated approach that focuses on the ecology of a community. So it also implicates discussions on what is called the new museology. And it refers to new approaches brought about by postmodernism in museums. It also an effect of postmodernism because it became concerned with the museum's environment. So it's just not within the museum but also outside, hence this idea of museum without walls. And then in the 1960s, there was a really great movement that happened in France, and they advocated for open-air museums that involved communities, and it was led by Georges-Henri Rivière. So just to give you an example, the traditional museum concept, the important elements are buildings, okay, tangible collections, the experts, and then the technical work of a museum. So it has to be, that's why it's a bit separate from the environment. In eco-museums, the following are linked. So environment is very important. The collections have to be both tangible and intangible. And the community members become important, not just experts. Sometimes the experts are the community members because they have the memory of the place. And then it started the question of what is the museum's purpose? Why do we want it? Okay. So it's like throwing a pebble in water, in the body of water, and then the eco-museum concept became larger and larger, and sometimes we don't know that it's called an eco-museum concept, but it's happening now, and the fact that we're talking about museum without walls is part of that whole movement. So the philosophy is that it breaks away from the traditional work of a museum, such as taxonomic research and systematic display of objects. Instead, it looks at why these may be important to the community. Why do we want it? Why do the community think that it's important? Sometimes museums can be called community centers. It doesn't have to be the model, for instance, that the National Museum is espousing. And it gives power to members of the community. So this is a nice picture. These men in a certain part of the southern Luzon region, they actually are very liberated. No? They can cook. Here they're preparing a very nice uh, delicacy. They can wash clothes and they can iron. No? So if you want to find men who can do all the homework, they can. They we can recommend to you. But this is I've worked with them, and just going around doing field work in the site makes me think that the eco museum here is alive without the physical museum. So it is concerned with humanity that drives its deep commitment to the conservation and care for collections. And some community members do, and we have been pointed that out during our field work in Tayabas, where these men live, that they do have certain objects that they care for, and that could be a model for museum practice. So just to give you an idea where the Philippines is, I think sometimes we talk about our country and we don't have an idea where we are, so it's this side, okay? So it's very important that we link up. But the other thing that we have to consider when we're putting together programs is all these global Filipinos. So just to give you an idea that 10% of the population of the Philippines is outside the Philippines as I speak. No? And how do we actually address them? Because they are important. And you can see the statistic. No? And so it's quite a concern. And for instance, I've lived in some of these areas, like in Italy, and have seen how, for instance, the Filipinos, when they settle in one area, they actually put together the practices that they have back home. So it's quite interesting that they do have processions, Catholic processions, and even some of their fiestas and rituals happening in the cities where they live. No? So it's really like world domination sometimes. And then also all the Filipinos who work as seafarers. No? So nearly 30% of the seafarers in the global labor market are actually Filipinos. No? So we have all these parents and childbearing Filipinos abroad. So it's really quite a worry because it has some sociological impact. And we've had a few projects, not when I'm not in the National Museum, but when I was attached to the University of the Philippines. And we had this photography project where a Dutch photographer went around all the ships of the world and photographed the Filipinos. It was quite an amazing project. And the one thing that we didn't think would be the outcome of this project was to find out that a lot of the relatives of these Filipino seafarers didn't know how hard it was to work in these ships. Yeah. So you can see huge tankers being cleaned by a lot of these men. So the whole idea of looking at museum practice, particularly in the Philippines, is that we have quite a few lessons learned, and we continue to learn. I think we're all lifelong learners. Is that we have to place the context of what we're doing even outside the museum. That museums can be sites for investigation. And then that museums can be more than contact zones beyond Clifford. They could be dreamscapes, like Kavana mentioned, or areas of liberation, like Krebs wrote in her book, and sites of multivalent identities and identity formation. So there's this, I've noticed that when I watch our visitors come in the museum and see how they regard our exhibitions, and I think there should be like a more systematic way of doing some documentation on that. We could be more inclusive to include previously marginalized groups. It's really, we need to engage the disengaged. And like, for instance, the seafarers are important, or the Filipinos abroad are also important for us to involve. So, for instance, this is again in Tayabas, at southern Luzon town. How could we place this in a museum? In this this intangible heritage. It's a procession of Saint Isidore, who actually is the patron saint of farmers. No? And every May 15, they have processions, sometimes small like this, sometimes bigger. You know, it involves thousands of people. So this is like in a really nice area of the Philippines, but no one has really looked into this deeper, except for anthropologists like me. And this is the image of Saint Isidore that goes around. And during that time, there's a lot of gift giving and sharing. So the challenges really is a lot. But I think one of the strategies is really to develop more exhibition idioms that can fit in paradigms that we never really have seen before. And I think always it's field work. As an anthropologist, I always recommend it. Field work is really the key. We need to create a vocabulary too of how we should put together that exhibition. We have to find ways to interpret what we see and make them understandable, especially to the more marginalized societies. No? And then we have to do more documentation and to see how that also translates, no, from fieldwork. And I always encourage artist residency programs, especially for non-art collections, and see how they get that together and put together, propose not only an artwork but even an exhibition, so that it could be translated in different ways. What I have here, this image is actually, this was an exhibition in Spain, and this is by Isabel Aquilizan and her husband. And it's actually what we call the Balikbayan box, because most Filipinos send stuff back home. And so what they've done is take out the cartons and just have the contents displayed as an installation. So it's quite a good thing. And that exhibition took place about 10 years ago in Spain, in Madrid. So it's really quite gratifying to see how our different audiences respond to our exhibitions. These are Ifugao men and women who performed at the Senate of the Philippines, and they required us to meet with them and then also see our exhibit. So it's nice. They would, in this particular instance, they were saying, we have this, and we can share some of our stuff with you and all that. So it's really quite nice to see them react to that. And just as a final set of slides, I wanted to actually talk about what we had a pilot program last Saturday. So it's very fresh, no? And it's the Batang Pambansang Museo program, which is Pambansang Museo is a national museum. So it's the children of not the National Museum. We decided to target a group that's just outside the National Museum. There's a lot of informal settlements around our area. And we decided from there, we could find children who could later on become docents for young people, young visitors. And we've seen that become a success in Singapore, for instance, piloted by our friend. And it's really quite a good thing for young people to talk to young people about the museum. So this was last Saturday, and this is one of the best guides that we have in the museum, eliciting a lot of responses from these children who saw the big painting, the Spoliarium by Juan Luna. And then they were divided up into groups. They were brought to different parts of the National Museum of Fine Arts. This particular group saw 18th century scientific illustrations of plants. And then our fern specialist, John Ray, brought them to the Philippine National Herbarium, which is also under the National Museum, and talked about the biodiversity of the Philippines in really quite not simple terms, but actually understandable terms. No? And I think from there, we managed to have young people who are now fans of Rafflesia, the giant flower. And during the time after lunch, they decided they wanted to perform quite spontaneously, so museums can also be sites for fun. So they were teaching us the new dance steps. And then we got, I actually exploit my friends quite shamelessly, and so I got my friend who runs art workshops to teach the children how to draw, and from there they drew their experience for that day, so that they could take that back with them as their souvenirs, and then we gave them more coloring materials, art materials. So these are the Rafflesia fan club of Intramuros, because they actually they were quite impressed with the flower after they saw that in the Philippine National Herbarium. Wait, sorry. And behind them, actually, is a group of volunteers from the Metro Bank corporate group, corporate social responsibility, and they are now working with us as docents. They're developing their volunteer scheme to include docents in the National Museum. Okay. The inspiration for the Batang Pambansang Museo actually comes from this young man who volunteered, I think 2 summers ago. And he was so enthusiastic. He was going around the exhibition 5 Centuries of Maritime Trade. And it was just really fun to see him get these children focusing on the particular areas of the exhibition, such as this one. So just as a final thank you, we had visitors from Museum Siam last June, and this is my director here, and he sends his good wishes to you, and for also making us be heard in this very important forum. Thank you. So please contact me after this one.